So this is one of our favorite case studies. And if you sort of dug underneath it, it's very similar to Hugh's profile. But this is a strategist. I think that we modified it a little bit, but it's very close to Hugh's profile. Take charge, 69. He's 97% of the population. He's more take charge than 97% of the population. Reserved, 31. Fast-paced, 34. Skeptical, which means asking questions, 26. He's 1%. So that means 99% of the population is more trusting than he is. Pioneering, 79. Risk-taking, 72. And anchored, 43. Does that make sense? How that works, the intensity? And these factors all sort of work together. So that's why, looking at the two top behavioral factors really drives a lot of the activity of the individual. But when you're coaching them, you really want a more deeper understanding of who they are. And then his two top behavioral scores for this one would be pioneering and skeptical. Michelle?
Can you just explain those percentages again?
Yeah. So think about out of 100% of the population. Mm-hmm. So the scoring, even on your individual report, shows your percentage to the total population. So for Chris Coddington, it means his 69 score, his raw T-score, he's 97% more take charge than the rest of the population. If you look at his skeptical score, it says 1%. It means that he's 99%, that 99% of the population is more trusting than he is. He's so skeptical. Does that make sense? And each one of these would be to the population. And when you see on this workplace operations report, the percentage, that's your percentage to the population.
It seems almost like a conflict, an inner conflict there with those two, because I'd like to know the definitions and go more in depth, because a pioneer who's skeptical, it seems like he'd be in inner turmoil all the time.
He probably is, but it's an interesting thing. You see that with the pioneering is, again, I'm going to break through roadblocks that other people would just say, oh, if there's a roadblock, I'm not going to pursue it. Pioneering means I will. Skeptical means I'm not going to trust. I'm going to ask until I get comfortable. Then I can be more pioneering. Same thing with Keith, and because I think you have a high skeptical. It's in not probably 26, but you learn because you're asking questions. Where Michelle has that more trusting, and I think you do too. You trust right from the onset until somebody proves you wrong. Keith doesn't get into that situation. If he doesn't sense something, he's probably going to probe and ask. That's the scale, being skeptical and trusting. So in entrepreneurial world, skeptical can be a very good thing, because if you trust, it serves you well, right? Because I'm going to probe and question before I trust. Where if he was pioneering and high trusting, which you don't see that high correlation, if somebody says, oh yeah, you can do that, but there's no basis or facts, well, it could be leading the entrepreneur down the wrong path. So skeptical actually helps them, because that's how they learn. So I always say, the more skeptical somebody is, some of us see them as interrogators. Our friend Sasha, who Michelle works, I know she's got a high skeptical score, or it's low. If you're sort of not prepared for that, Sasha can come off pretty strong. It's like, oh my gosh, what happened here? But that's why she learns by asking.
They
but
show
sometimes
you the risk, where the risk lies.
They do.
The naysayers
Yep.
and block that have you look at the full picture.
Because I do tend to lean a little bit more on the trusting side. So I trust Hugh's, hey, that's not the right path to go. And he can't even tell me why sometimes. He just sort of can see it. So, we got to pay attention.
Anchored, and that translates to sort of more self-assuredness versus...
This is probably serving him well, because he is a little anchored. If he was super creative, he'd want to change it all the time. At least we have a point in time. The anchoredness can benefit consistent process. But he may need other people to help, and he has, to create. because he's not going to be as creative. Does that make sense?
Further out.
There you go.
More, right.
There's your bell curve.
Oh.
Everybody's been asking for it by popular demand. So you're correct that when I mentioned between 40 and 60 is fairly moderate, but even 45 to 55, that's the definition of an adapter. Very mid-range, can be adaptable, take charge, cooperative, but if you get out farther into the 20, when you meet people that have that score of 20 or somebody that's close to 80, that can't be modified as easily. It's very, they sort of have to figure out what their strength is and how they can temper it to get to work with people, because they're just very intense. And so the distribution, you see this here. Is that helpful? So I like to key in on the two top behavioral factors. I'm spontaneous and I'm a risk taker, and it's very core to me, and I've made a lot of decisions using those two. But if his spontaneous and his risk taking is much higher than mine, but it's not his intensity of his behavior. His is pioneering and skeptical. So you can see that's why it's important to know the information when you're working with somebody, just how intense it is. And so when you're actually doing sort of coaching with people, recognizing if they have a really intense score, probe a little bit, ask questions. They've made decisions that have happened to them, and it's sometimes blind spots. It can be the struggle. You can help unlock potential, just recognizing that's the intensity of they didn't even know it. Any questions on this? Okay. We talk a lot about strengths. I'm a huge believer of not focusing on your struggles. When I was at Cox, one of the things was I'm spontaneous, which is opposite of planned. I had a very, being in a finance organization, the planning, but fortunately because there's team members can help put that planning into place. But if you focus, and even with Marcus Buckingham's work, if you focus on somebody's sort of weaknesses or struggles, they can't optimize their performance. They've got to figure out a way to balance it. It doesn't mean that I don't put some planning into my day, because I have to. All of us have to. But I know that I can at least leverage the team, or I can put processes into place to keep me from falling into that trap of focusing on my struggles. Because I'm much better if I do use that spontaneity and that risk-taking in the work that I do. I think every one of us, if we sat down, thought about it, our strengths are really important. And those mid-range scores are going to be flexible. You can sort of flex it. But if you have pretty intense behavior, that score, recognize it, play into that. Any questions on this? No? Okay. You guys are. So here, we call them work-life drivers. And again, it's those 5 factors: the commanding, people, patience, structure, and trust. And Hugh talked a little bit about it. The more intense that somebody is in their scoring, you see these behaviors: blunt, talkative, lenient, rigid, forgiving on this side. Over here, diplomatic, withdrawn, critical, unfocused, and wary. So when people are under stress, a lot of times they go into the amygdala hijack pretty quickly. These things will happen. And I'll pick on our engagers, because a lot of you probably beat me up. When there's stress, sometimes they will talk, because that's a stress behavior that can come out. And sometimes, when you're with people, you might say some things that you really didn't mean to say, because it's just, you really just being a stress behavior. It's talking. It's a coping. But sometimes you might say something that you like, ooh, I wish I hadn't said that. Where those reserved people wouldn't say that. So when there's pressure situations, sometimes that talkativeness comes out. And you sort of like, wow, I can't believe they said that. Same thing with take charge. Comes out as blunt. It can be pretty hard edge sometimes when somebody's really take charge and then they're under stress and they have that high score. Over here in cooperative, I've worked with people that have that high diplomatic score, and they will never tell you in a group what they really think, because they don't want to rock the boat. So they're nodding, yes, I totally agree, yeah. And they're like, no, I don't really agree. It can happen. A lot of times you get, you think you're rowing in the right direction and they'll surprise you. Because they want to, there's more, in their minds, they want to be part of the team more than sort of rocking the boat, but they may not agree. Withdrawn, you see that quite a bit on that reserve factor. On fast pace, you can see critical, being critical. Paul, you've never done that, right? Spontaneity, unfocused, can really, that's one of my stress behaviors is I can literally become unfocused pretty quickly. And it's not a good thing. You got to really stay grounded. And then skeptical, they can literally wear down. They get almost like difficult withdraw. And then on the trusting side, be more forgiving if they're in that stress behavior. I'll just forgive. Even though somebody's really been sort of violated your space or your values, you'll in that very hard, if it's pretty intense, be more forgiving. If they just say, hey, I'm sorry, and then but they did some pretty rough things. Does that make sense? So just recognize the higher those scores, more intense behavior. And then on the last three, so these are the way that we sort of construct relationships and results. And then on the workplace direction and drive, remember those three, the pioneering, the risk, and the creativity. Any of us in the 10 profiles can have an element of these that aren't always correlated to the results and relationships. Any questions on that? You guys know it pretty well? A lot of this gets sort of cemented when we go through sort of the discussion, when we see other people's reports. And then these are really around sort of these three profiles that are in that top quadrant, the goal setter types, and with where we see people, sort of roles, because we do a lot of benchmark work with firms around sort of where they would be best suited. You can see that operations manager, outside sales, and entrepreneur, and sort of their risk or their scoring pattern. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on benchmarking a little later, but I just wanted to show you sort of what, how that's constructed on the result side. Relationships, engagers, community builders, and relationship builders. Trainer, inside sales, and solution design. You can get pretty deep in the benchmark, when you're actually hiring for a role. But I think, a lot of times when we're recruiting, we need, somebody that's going to be a little bit more process focused. We need more of that reflective thinker. We sort of think in that terms, but you really do need to know that deeper when you're actually interviewing somebody, a little bit deeper into the profile.